Well, welcome back to our discussion on the book of Romans. Again, looking at the message of the Bible from the perspective of the book of Romans, trying to understand its message and how it contributes to the Bible's overall story. And we've looked already at the problem that gave rise to Paul writing the book of Romans and combined with the many purposes for which Paul wrote the book. And today we want to begin looking at the narrative aspect of Romans. What story is Paul trying to tell, or is Paul telling, in this great book? And in order to move us towards that, let me begin with a little bit of a thought experiment here for you. Here's the question. Is Romans the greatest letter ever written? What do you think? Well, I'm posing that question because in 2007, Benjamin Merkle wrote an article titled, "Is Romans Really the Greatest Letter Ever Written?" And in the introduction to the article, he refers to a teaching series by John Piper that titles Romans as the greatest letter ever written. And he cites major figures from church history who make similar statements, such as Martin Luther and John Calvin and William Tyndale. And Merkle goes on to argue for an affirmative answer to his question. Well, the purpose of this series isn't to settle that debate, but the fact that we can even ask the question shows just how highly regarded this letter is in Christian history, and that for good reason. So the doctrine of justification, for example, so central to the Protestant Reformation, constitutes one of the main topics of the book of Romans. Douglas Moo claims no biblical book has had a greater impact on the church's theology. And likewise, Joseph Fitzmyer claims one can almost write the history of Christian theology by surveying the ways in which Romans has been interpreted. So Romans has received exhaustive scholarly focus, and it's led to seasons of church and personal spiritual renewal. And because, as these scholars are observing, it hits on the heart of so many Christian topics, and again has been central in seasons of church renewal or theological exploration. So what I want to do in this discussion is just give you a glimpse of the greatness of Romans by showing how Romans fits within the Bible's main storyline. And my contention is that Romans has been central to the life of the church because its message clearly and decisively contributes to the central story of the Bible. Again, the whole approach of these discussions, the Bible according to Romans. Romans sits at the center of the Bible's message. If that message is a great river, then Romans is a boat right in the middle of that river going in that very direction. You can almost see the whole through the lens of the book of Romans. So that raises a question then, all right, what is that central story? And how does Romans find its place within that story? And so let me set up this discussion by considering a comment Paul makes in Acts about the whole purpose of God. In Acts 20, verses 26 and 27, Paul makes the following declaration to the Ephesian elders. "And now I know that none of you, among whom I have gone about proclaiming the kingdom, will ever see my face again. Therefore I declare to you this day that I am not responsible for the blood of any of you, for I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose of God." So this is part of Paul's farewell speech after ministering in Ephesus for about 3 years. And in just 3 years, Paul claims, he declared to the Ephesians the whole purpose of God. So what does Paul mean by this phrase, the whole purpose of God? Did he preach the entire Old Testament and all the New Testament books that have been written up to that point? Well, let me tell you how G.K. Beale defines this phrase. He describes it as God's purposeful activity in salvation history. Once again, God's purposeful activity in salvation history. So the whole counsel of God is what God is doing, his purpose, in salvation history. In other words, in history, throughout the history of the world since God has introduced his redemptive saving purposes. And Beale's claim is that Paul spent 3 years summarizing that purpose for the Ephesians. So here's what Beale doesn't mean. Beale doesn't mean that this approach nullifies the rest of the Bible. As in, Paul, found his favorite passages, his favorite themes. He majored on those and he just got rid of the others. Rather, here's what Beale means. Focusing on this central message or this summarizing message actually serves the many details of the Bible. This deposit, this whole purpose of God, provides order and illumination to the various biblical details. And Paul therefore summarizes this message so that when he leaves, the Ephesian elders can reflect further on those details and gain greater clarity about them through the lens of the summarized deposit. Essentially, here's what Beale is saying. The whole purpose of God is the summary of the Bible story that serves as the lens through which we see and by which we make sense of all the material in the Bible. You see, Paul couldn't teach them everything there was to know in just 3 years, but he could give them a framework. He could give them lenses. And that framework and those lenses would enable the Ephesians to continue to understand the scriptures so they could discern what God was doing in the world and find their place in that purpose. In other words, Paul gave them enough framework so they could make sense of the whole. And if they understood the framework, then they would be able to discern, here's what God is doing, here's what God is up to, and most importantly, here's how we find our place in that purpose. So what I want to do in this discussion, and we'll continue this one and then the next, we'll spend a few discussions focusing on this, but I want to sketch the Bible's story as a whole and then situate Romans within it.